All right, so it's good to be with you here this evening. I have a lot of material that I really want to cover here, and as I was writing this, at some point I realized, yeah, I probably can't say everything that I really want to say about this. But at the same time, I am the last talk tonight, so maybe I could keep you a little while. No, I will try to keep it to 45 minutes here. So, the topic of the talk is the beatific vision and participation in divine love. Now, for this talk, I have drawn on a few different theologians. These are Lutheran writers. I recognize that the majority of you here are not Lutherans, but I contend that the Lutheran tradition has a lot to say to the Church Catholic, and I hope that you will feel that way as well as we look at some of this material. And so there are four parts to this talk. The first one is I want to look at the definition of religion, which seems maybe like a strange place to go. But then the second thing I want to do is look at a classical presentation from one of the great theologians of Lutheran Orthodoxy of the beatific vision. And then the third thing I want to do is look at specifically the doctrine of divine love from a 19th century theological text. And then the fourth thing I want to do is give some application as to how this matters today. That's a lot. And I recognize that any of those points could easily be a talk in themselves. Okay. Well, as I said, I begin here in what is perhaps a seeming bit of a strange place, and that is that I want to begin by defining religion. And what I want to say is that the way that we define religion is going to be relevant to the topic that we're talking about, both the topic of the beatific vision as well as the topic of divine love and participation in divine love. Now, talking about the definition of religion, this is something that usually is going to show up in theological textbooks in the prolegomena section. Prolegomena meaning the things said before. So prolegomena is kind of your preliminary stuff that you want to say about theology and method before you actually jump into the particulars of your theology, looking at various specific dogmas. And so again, it might seem a little bit strange to start at the very beginning when what we're talking about at this conference is really what happens at the end. We're talking about eschatology, the last things, the vision of God that we have. And what I want to say is that where we start and where we end should always be connected. How we engage in any discipline has to be done with an end in view, right? For any discipline, you have to ask the question, what exactly is this discipline for? What is its end? What is its telos, its purpose? And so I think we need, when we're talking about the discipline of theology itself, to start at the end, to say, what's the point of theology? What is the purpose of theology? Because that tells us something about what theology is supposed to be about. What are we supposed to do, right? To define things by their end defines the boundaries around a discipline. It tells you what kind of questions you should be asking. Okay, so with that being said, I want to look at a definition of religion. Now, theology and religion aren't precisely identical, but this definition of religion comes from a 19th century American Lutheran theologian by the name of Henry Eister Jacobs. And this comes from his book, Elements of Religion. And he writes the following definition. He says, religion is the communion of man with God. Oh no, my tablet just turned off here. It affirms not only the possibility, but also the reality of a life of man in God and a life of God in man. God and man are forever distinct. There are two personalities, one infinite and the other finite, bound together in the closest union so that the finite is made partaker of the resources of the infinite. And so what Jacobs is doing here is he is defining religion as communion. I think it is important to note here that he is not defining religion as some like legal transaction. So you get this critique often in the 20th century from Roman Catholic scholars who tried to make the argument that the Reformation kind of moved from this participatory idea of salvation to one that is simply a distant legal transaction, right? God is just a distant judge, and he judges sinners either innocent or guilty. Now, obviously, it is certainly part of not only Protestant theology, but theology of Scripture to say that God is a judge and he does judge innocent and guilty. But that certainly is not all that there is to say. And what I want to say here is if theologians like Jacobs are defining religion itself as communion and participation, they're certainly not working from only a legal framework. Well, what he's talking about here when he speaks of this life of man in God, life of God in man, is what has been referred to as the unio mystica, or the mystical union, the mysterious union that the believer has with God, that he shares his life with us. This has been talked about in various ways. Johannes Quenstedt, who was another one of the great Lutheran theologians of the 17th century, along with David Hollatz, who we're going to look at in a moment, he uses the language of, he says this is a substantial union. Not substantial in the sense that God and man become one singular essence, but in the sense that there are two substances, distinct, God and man, or as Jacob says, finite and infinite, that come into real union. And he speaks about this, Quenstedt, as a mutual interpenetration of essences. In some way, we live in God and he lives in us. And so as Jacob says, this mystical union is the very end for which man was created. This is our purpose. We were created for intimate communion with God, for participation in God while always remaining distinct from God. This is the end for which God created man in the garden. Adam and Eve were created in communion with God, and that communion was, though inaugurated, not yet consummated, not in its final perfect state, as we will talk about here with the Beatific vision. And so if religion is communion, what then is theology? Because they're related concepts, but not quite the same. Well, this is at least how Jacobs defines it. He says the discipline of theology is a science that teaches who these persons are, God and man, in communion, whence this communion comes, what it is, and whither it tends. So that is what theology is all about. It is really the science of the study of this communion. Who is in communion, how it was lost, how it is regained, and what our end is. Now, I do want to say that as I define communion here, communion does not necessarily mean beatific vision. One could certainly imagine all kinds of communion that you might have with someone else. I mean, you have a kind of communion with other people, which is not identical with anything like the beatific vision. And so we have all sorts of kinds of communion. But what I want to say is that the beatific vision is an essential element of what communion means. And what I'm going to argue is there are two essential elements to communion. One is the intellectual vision, that is the beatific vision, and the second is sharing in divine love. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of this talk here, and that is that I'm going to look at some things said, definitions of the beatific vision from one of the great champions of Protestant orthodoxy, David Hollatz. And the age of orthodoxy, as it's sometimes termed, is the era following the Protestant Reformation through the beginning of the 18th century. This is the age of really the flowering of a new kind of scholasticism that is referred to often as Protestant scholasticism, which is not identical with medieval scholasticism, but it shares many similarities with it. And this era is categorized by just a lot of explanatory depth within theological writing. And so David Hollatz is sometimes considered the last of the great Lutheran theologians within the age of Orthodoxy. He lives into the beginning of the 18th century. And this treatment of the beatific vision appears in his work, the Examen Theologicum Achromaticum, and there will be a quiz afterwards, so hope you all get this straight. And in this work, he talks about the beatific vision within his theological prolegomena. And so he treats this at the very beginning because he is trying to say theology always operates with this end in view. And he does treat it later as well in his section on eschatology. So we have it as these kind of bookends, which I think is pretty appropriate because Scripture itself works with these kinds of bookends. You notice the themes of the beginning of Genesis in the Garden of Eden are the same themes that show up in Revelation, like the tree of life, for example. And so we bookend our theology in a similar way, upholding the beatific vision is something that tells us something about the methodology of theology, but it also then leads towards the ends of theology. Okay, and so when he writes of the beatific vision, he presents this as part of the end or the aim of the theological discipline. And so he defines the end of theology, or the goal, the telos of theology, as the objective end and then the formal end. And so he says the objective end of theology is the infinitely perfect and supremely beneficent God, God himself. And then the second is the formal end, which he says is the beatific vision. Elsewhere, Hollatz is going to define the ultimate aim of theology as consisting in two eschatological realities. The first is the intuitive knowledge of God, and the latter, the fruition of God, as we'll be talking about here. So the former of these, the first of these, is the beatific vision. The second of these is the eternal enjoyment of God, which I'm going to say is largely divine love we are talking about here. So Hollatz offers the following definition of the beatific vision. He says the beatific vision is an act of the intellect illumined with the light of glory by which it perceives God clearly and immediately and as he is in himself. And so as we heard in some earlier talks today, it is important to highlight here that the word sight, as it is being used here, is not necessarily sight with one's physical eyes. Now, actually, there was a 17th century debate about this point. Everybody was agreed that sight was primarily that of the intellect, but there was a debate between a theologian named Johannes Musaeus and then Abraham Kolov over this particular issue of whether the physical eyes are partake of the beatific vision. So it's a really popular topic to bring up at parties. Just a piece of advice for you. You want to be popular, make friends, and influence people. I think that's the way to go. Talk about the Musaeus Kolov debate. Now, that particular debate is really not that important. Like it's not the most essential thing as to whether this also relates to the physical eyes, because that's not the primary thing. And Hollatz kind of avoids this, and he's like, yeah, it's probably the physical eyes, but let's not worry about it too much. And so that's what I'm going to say here. Don't worry about it too much. Because the important point is what we call the intellectual vision. Now, to talk about what intellectual means in this particular context, we need to understand a little bit of how it is that people are thinking in this particular context, the kinds of language that they're using, the categories that they're thinking in, because they're often different from the categories that we tend to think in. So I have to define a little bit what the intellect actually is in this context. Now, first I want to say every element of nature, as God has created it, has a particular end for which it was created and toward which it tends. This is true certainly of the material world. There is purpose within the material world. I mean, think about just your physical body, right? You've got different body parts and they all have a different end or function or purpose. You have eyes, and your eyes have a telos, an end, a goal. There's a reason they're there, which is that you might see. Right? The legs have a particular end, which is mobility. The ears, which is hearing. So every part of your physical body also has an end or a purpose. Your eyes don't just like incidentally happen to see. That's why they're there, right? That's why you have it. That's the goal. And so I want to say that not only do the physical elements of human beings have particular and unique ends toward which they tend, but so do the immaterial parts of the human being. And so here I'm going to identify two particular powers or faculties of the soul that David Hollatz is working with here. And there are various ways to kind of categorize the faculties or powers. I'm not going to get into those particulars and debates here, but I'm just going to define these as two, which are the intellect and the will. Okay, the intellect and the will. Now, also, it is important to also highlight this, because this is going to be important to what we're going to talk about in a little bit, is that human beings also have affections or loves. These are inclinations that drive desire or distaste. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, I want to say that eternal glory, as Hollatz is talking about it here, provides distinct goals or ends for the intellect, will, and affections, which all fulfill their divinely directed roles within the consummate state, within eternal glory. Okay, so let's do a little bit of definition here to talk about this. What is the definition, the distinction between these various immaterial faculties relative to the roles within the human being? Well, the aim, the goal, the telos of the intellect is an apprehension of that which is true. That's what your intellectual faculty does. That's the purpose, right? It's supposed to grasp truth. That is its end, and that means the grasping of truth by the intellect is a good in itself. I actually think this is really important to say because, I hear this all the time as a theologian and one who, yes, sometimes does like the little, tiny particulars of theological discussions. I often hear the response that like, well, you shouldn't really just be worried about, gaining knowledge, right? You shouldn't just be worried about learning more stuff. That's not what's really important. What's really important is, I don't know, either your Christian experience or the things you do with your hands, your actions. These are all important. But I want to say that if it is indeed true that the telos, the end of the intellectual faculty, is to apprehend truth, that means that understanding truth, especially divine truth, is inherently good. It doesn't need to have another direct purpose. Now, there's a distinction that's made. Johann Musaeus, who I mentioned a little bit ago. I don't expect you to remember who all these people are, but he says, talking about the practical nature of theology, he says, well, all theology is practical in one sense, and so he distinguishes between something that is practical formally, which would be something where it's like, well, here's a given directive. Here's a truth that says, you should go out and do this thing. But then he says, other truths are practical virtually. They help to like form your rational mind so that they don't have to have a direct effect, but they still are practical, right? They are still forming you in the way that God wants you to be formed because you are using your God-given faculties for their God-given ends. Okay, so I think that's important to highlight here as we're talking about this. All right. So as we're talking about the end of the intellect, we apprehend all sorts of truths in life. Sometimes we apprehend truths that are kind of just aggregation of facts, like when you're studying for a test. If you're, say, in one of my confessions classes, I've got a couple students here. Maybe you're using that faculty to try to remember the names of a bunch of German princes in the 16th century. Probably not something that you're learning because you really love the material, right? But it is a good use of the intellect to use your mind in that way. But God is truth in a far higher sense than these mere facts, right? God is truth itself. And so that means that if the end of the intellect is the apprehension of truth, the ultimate goal of the intellect has to be the intellectual grasping of the one who is truth itself. Even just from a logical perspective, it seems kind of necessitated by the nature of the matter that the beatific vision is the end of the intellect. It is what it has been created for. And it is here that we now talk about what the beatific vision is. What is it that we have this kind of intellectual sight of God himself? Well, in the glorified state, the faith of the redeemed human being becomes sight. The intellect grasps its source and its goal, right? God is the source of the intellect. He is the goal, the end of the intellect. And it does this through a direct vision of God, a direct vision of the essence of God. Now, clarification has to be made here, and was already made in some of the earlier talks here, that this knowledge that we receive of God in the beatific vision is true, but it is not absolutely comprehensive, right? No creature knows the divine nature exhaustively, as this is an impossibility for a created being. The limitation on human knowledge is often explained here in a classical distinction between two types of theology, archetypal and ectypal. Archetypal theology refers to God's own self-knowledge. And archetypal theology says that God knows himself with a singular thought which absolutely comprehends the divine essence. This knowledge that God has of himself is indistinct from the divine essence. It is the divine essence. In other words, it's not something we can have, right? We can't have that kind of knowledge that God has of himself, or else we would be God, and we are not. And so there is always this distinction between the finite and the infinite. But that doesn't mean that we don't have real knowledge. We do indeed have real knowledge. And this second type of theology or knowledge is that which is ectypal. This ectypal theology is a derived knowledge. It's not disconnected from God's own knowledge of himself. It is a reflection of God's own knowledge of himself. It is based upon God's own knowledge of himself. I mean, think about this like making a blueprint, right? Say for a building. The building is based upon the blueprint. It's not disconnected from it, but it's not identical with it. And that's an analogy that's often used to refer to this archetype-ectype distinction and how these two things work together. So ectypal knowledge is a finite knowledge, but it is a true knowledge. Now, as Hallez describes this distinction here, he's asking the question, well, what is, when we have this vision of God, this intellectual vision of God, like what is the limit on it? So we know it can't be the kind of knowledge that God himself has of himself. So what limit is there on it? And Hallez says the only limitations upon the intellect for those who partake of the beatific vision are those limitations which are inherent to the nature of finitude as such. In other words, the limitations are not due to, say, differing intellects that human beings are going to have in eternity. The limits are only the limits that are just a necessary part of the distinction between creature and creator, whatever that means. Okay. And we often have to say this when we're talking about these things, whatever that means, right? That we are going beyond the limits of human knowledge when we're talking about these things. We speak only of what has been revealed. Okay. And so Hallez says this. He says that those in glory know all those things which are formally in God, in the highest degree of perfection, as far as the finite intellect elevated by the light of glory is capable. Okay, just to define what he means when he uses this word formally, he means that which is in the divine nature inherently. He means the divine essence itself. This is distinguished from that which God knows virtually or immanently. That is the knowledge that God has of things outside of himself. Right? So God not only knows all about himself, but he knows everything about everything else in existence. He knows, everything about even, theoretical possibilities of what could be the case. And so we are certainly not given any indication in Scripture that when we have this vision in glory and this knowledge in glory, that somehow now we have access to like every thought that every human being has ever had. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the knowledge that is formally within God, the divine essence itself. Now, we have to talk about another aspect of this, as Hollatz presents it here, is that this knowledge is referred to as intuitive knowledge. And that is a really key word here. Okay, so what exactly is intuitive knowledge? By intuitive, he means that God is known by direct apprehension rather than some secondary way, like a syllogistic reasoning, like a logical proof, indirect reference or symbolic representation. These other forms of knowing are what Hollatz refers to as abstractive knowledge or abstractive reasoning. We could think of a kind of abstractive reasoning when we're talking about like natural theology, for example. If you look at the classical proofs of God's existence, this is abstractive. When you say, look at effects in the world and reason from the existence of various effects to a first cause of those effects, that would be abstractive, right? You're coming to a knowledge of God by way of reasoning from something else. And so this beatific vision, though, we're referring to an unmediated knowledge of God. Right? It is unmediated. It doesn't come through any other means. It is direct. This is distinct from how God reveals himself in the world today. Right? In the present age, we do not experience this. Within the present order of the world, God reveals himself through means. We call the means of grace. He reveals himself in the words, in the sacraments. Now, when we make a distinction between what we have in this age and the age to come, the distinction is not a distinction between divine absence and divine presence, right? So it's not like in the present age, God is absent from us, and then we will be present with him. He is certainly present with us today. He just doesn't reveal himself in this beatified sense. God mediates his presence with us today through created nature. He is already immanent with the church, even today, as he incorporates his people into intimate communion with him. Yet, this mystical union is not a source of rational comprehension, at least not directly. In other words, even though we are in this intimate union with God, we do not derive our knowledge of God from our experience of the union. We derive our knowledge of God from revelation. Okay, now we move on to a second aspect of this, because I said the way that Hollatz talks about it, he speaks about the intellect and the end of the intellect being the beatific vision, but now we have to talk about the second element of this end, and that is the fruition of God, or the enjoyment of God. These two things go hand in hand. And so just as this vision of God is the telos of the rational faculty in the human being, the enjoyment of God or fruition of God as the highest good is the end or the goal of the human will. The term that's used to describe this, the fruition of God, this comes from St. Augustine, who emphasizes this in his writing, and it's used pretty broadly within the broader Augustinian tradition. Hollatz gives the following definition of this enjoyment of God. He says it is an act of the will by which the blessed in the celestial fatherland most avidly embrace, most sweetly perceive, and are most fully satisfied with God, the highest good. In human life in this age, the will is constantly seeking for its own actualization. Our wills are constantly moved by various pleasures and desires. We are repulsed by one thing and act against it, and enticed by another and act in accord with that desire. These inclinations or desires are referred to often as passions or affections. Now, the will is not absolutely beholden to the passions, but it does generally and often accord with the passions, especially when there is no rational seeming reason to decide otherwise. Now, the passions have been divided into various categorizations, but the passions by some are said to be often kind of instantiations of two basic things that we can divide out into other categories. And those two things are attraction or revulsion, or love and hate. These affections are various. Some of them can be based on, man's bodily nature. We have these various animal desires. So, human beings desire bodily things like food or sleep or sex. Certain biological impulses just exist within material beings, things that are necessary for the sustaining of life. But we can also talk in a higher sense of those passions, those desires that relate to higher things that man and woman do not share with the animal world. We have attraction to, for example, like certain kinds of music. You might have a love, a desire to learn about a particular subject, or you might have an attraction, desire to go see a beautiful sunset in a way that differentiates us from the animal world. Now, these various affections often guide the decisions that we make, not in a totally absolute sense, but we do tend to make the decisions toward things that we are attracted to rather than the ones that we aren't. It'd be kind of silly not to do that. For example, if, say, you really love history, but you think chemistry is really boring, it doesn't matter if you're like particularly good at chemistry, you're probably going to choose to major in history because that's what you enjoy. Oftentimes, the rational faculty, like the things that we learn, the knowledge that we gain, can actually shape our affections, can shape how we feel about certain things. For example, I know I'm weird because I like some early modern art. Okay, I know that I'm not supposed to say that sometimes, and yes, I like Picasso. Okay, now part of why I like Picasso is I really love the world of ideas, and I love seeing how the world changes, and I love seeing how people respond to crisis. And there's something I think about especially the outbreak of the First World War, and just seeing something about how art is formed in response to that says something deeply about the human soul. So there's a love that I have for that era of art, even though maybe at first glance you're like, well, it's not like the most attractive thing. And classically, obviously, it's not. But I actually learned to love it because I saw what was around it, right? The motivations around it, the kind of crisis that people are facing that's so real and expressed in these various ways. You could think of this in other ways, like think about, okay, coffee. Okay, I'm drinking coffee all the time. I always drink coffee. And there was one point in my life, like in college, I just drank any coffee I got, right? Like whatever you get, it's fine, it's all coffee. But then I got really into coffee and I started drinking good coffee. When you start to drink more coffee, if you get really into coffee, you learn about beans and different roasts and origins, and you're starting to actually to use your rational mind to distinguish, right? You're learning to distinguish things, and it shapes how you feel about it. And now it's like, I don't like that. I have a little bit of revulsion from that cup of Folgers. I'll still drink it. But so your rational mind can't affect your desires. Okay. I am giving you so much information here, and I recognize that. So I kind of apologize here, but it's good to challenge you. I just know that it's at the end of the day, and you've listened to a lot of talks at this point. So I hope your rational faculties are still functioning at this point. Okay. Okay. So in ordinary human life, the will is like constantly moving, right? We're always making decisions. We're always seeking. We're often seeking objects of attraction, and we are often making choices that don't fulfill what that inner need is. We're often making decisions that make us feel empty inside. And that should tell us something. That should tell us that the will is not being directed toward its divinely intended purpose. That the affections are not satisfied ultimately, though you may get like fleeting pleasure from things, because they are not resting in their end. It's like if you feel hunger and you're like, I feel this feeling in my body that's uncomfortable. Let me try to deal with it by maybe I need to go exercise, right? Doesn't matter what other things you try to do, it's only going to go away if you do one thing, and that is eat, right? And so this is the same way with the will and the affections as well. Now, St. Augustine is the one who really highlights this in his writing, as he speaks about this state of restlessness that we have as human beings, that we finally and only find rest in our Creator. And so that is inherent to the soul, because we have a divinely created end, and that is communion with God. And it is only when we enter into that glorified state of communion, where we enjoy both the beatific vision and this enjoyment, this fruition of God directly, it is only there that the will ceases its striving, because it has reached its end, its purpose. The will, just as the intellect, finds its rest. And so the fruition of God is the end or goal of the will, just as the beatific vision is of the intellect. Now, we need to be careful not to distinguish these as if they're like totally separate realities. We can't bifurcate ourselves into like these totally distinct things. It's not like the intellect and will are separate substances or something. They are faculties contained within a singular soul, and they do find their end in a singular reality. And that reality is what I'm calling communion with God, to encapsulate all of these things together. And Hallat speaks of this. He says that both of these faculties find their singular end in a unified beatific object, which is God. Okay. And so this, just to make another connection point that I didn't make yet, the fruition of God is also direct, but it's also unmediated. The enjoyment of God is not mediated through anything else. Like our enjoyment of God in the present life often is. There are plenty of like psalms that praise God for his creation. Like creation, the beauty of creation is a means that delivers to us the beauty of God. But it doesn't bring ultimate satisfaction. This is going to bring ultimate satisfaction, because we not only see the things that image God or mirror God, but we see God directly. Now, there is, as Hallat is going to say, this prioritization of intellect over the will. And this is just generally true of human life in general. And prioritization, not in terms of like what's most important, but just to say in terms of ordering of what comes first. And this is part of the point I was trying to get at, that our rational mind can often drive our desires and our actions. And it should be the case, okay? And so, and I said this in my, the seminar I did earlier as an example of this, but like you recognize the priority of reason over will in every action that you take, really, if you stop to think about it. Like, why did you put on the clothes that you did this morning? It wasn't just that your will just acted. You just acted on impulse, because you may have left the house totally naked. You may have left the house in your pajamas. No, but like you stopped and thought, where am I going today? And what am I doing? And what would be the appropriate thing to wear? And as far as I know, everybody came in here today clothed. And so I think you did use your rational faculty when you woke up to get dressed, right? To say, this is what I need to do. And so it's the same here. So it says that the intellectual vision of God then is the basis for the movement of the will toward this end. Okay. Now, and I know I'm running low on time here, but now I'm moving on to my third point here, and a figure that I'm going to look at, and I'll try to do this briefly. And this is divine love. And yes, I know that was in the title of the talk, and now I've got like 6 minutes left, and I'm now just getting to it. But I think with all that background, this really helps to put some of this together. Well, talking about the goal of the Christian life as participation in love, this is a theme that is highlighted in another 19th century theologian who's German, named Ernst Wilhelm Sartorius. He has a book called The Doctrine of Divine Love. And this book is just a treatment of, well, the doctrine of divine love as it sounds, and he applies this to all sorts of things. He applies it to theology and ethics. And so Sartorius operates from the principle that love is at the heart of the Christian understanding of God, right? So he cites St. John, God is love. Okay. Now I do. Okay. There's a point that I really wanted to make, and I'm looking at time, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm sorry if I go a minute over here. This, I think, is important because I think that sometimes we can misunderstand this particular aspect of divine simplicity. Okay, so we have this doctrine of divine simplicity. We've heard about that some today. And divine simplicity makes the contention that there is no distinction between God and his attributes. And I think sometimes we can misunderstand this a little bit in this particular way. And now, I do want to make this caveat. I'm talking about how the Lutheran sources use this. So if one of the Reformed scholars here wants to be like, we don't talk in this way, then correct me, because I may be wrong. But at least among Lutheran sources, this is the way that we speak. Is that when we're speaking about the divine attributes, we don't have to equalize the divine attributes, okay? And so just because they're all not distinct from his essence doesn't mean that it is as true. Now, this sounds like a weird way of speaking. I'll try to clarify this. It's not as true to say that God is wrath as it is to say, or that God is wrathful, to say that God is loving or love. One of those things is actually more true than the other. Okay, that maybe sounds kind of weird. What I'm not doing is saying that these are distinct attributes in God. When we are using human terms that we call the attributes of God, we are using words that approximate the divine essence in some way. There are some words that approximate the divine essence a little bit more closely than some other words. And I think, and this is the way Luther talks, especially, he talks about salvation as God's proper work and judgment as his alien work, because he says in some way the acts of love and the redemption are like more proper. They more strongly correspond to the divine essence itself. Okay. This is the framework that Sartorius is working from when he does this. And so he's going to say that love is really the conception of Scripture, along with holiness, that is like the concept that we understand in our human experience that most closely corresponds to the divine essence as it is. Right? All these other conceptions also correspond to God in some way, but this one is the closest we can understand the divine essence. And so he wants to say then that when we come into communion with God, as we're talking about here, that is largely a participation in love. And he's saying, like, if it is the case that love communicates the divine essence in this unique sense, then we have to talk about any communion with God as ultimately a communion in love. And he does some things with like intertrinitarian love. We have various passages, especially in John's gospel, that talk about like, an eternal relation of love between Father and Son in eternity. And so there is a sense in which the goal of our lives ultimately is to participate in that love, the love of Father, Son, and Spirit. I'm looking at time here. Okay. Now, the way that Sartorius talks about this love, he says love is by its very nature unitive. Right? Love kind of unites you to the thing that you do love. And also, so love has this tendency to, bring us outside of ourselves towards some object that we love. And, generally when we love something, that is because there is something lovable within the thing itself. All right, so probably, if you're married, when you fell in love with your wife or your husband, there was something in that person that drew you to them. That love was then brought out. It was enticed, that you wanted to commune with them, right? And we know this kind of attraction that we have, especially to other people, or if you have a child, that's a very strong form of love. And that love engages the affections, but it also engages the will. And I had a whole thing I was going to talk about what the heart is, but I don't have time for that in relation to this. But if, say, the beauty of a sunset, because of its beauty, can draw you out and bring you into some kind of unitive relation with that. And if that is true with a child, if you have a child, that kind of experience you have of like first seeing that child that is yours, it's an amazing thing. This really amazing thing about love is that like you don't run out of it. It just multiplies. It's kind of crazy. So like you have a child and you think, I could never love anything as much as I love this child, right? Then you have another child and you're like, I love this child as much as I love the first child. And you could have 200 children and you'd love them all the same. It's just how it is. Like love multiplies. Like it doesn't have it just can never totally be satisfied. And so think about that in relation to God. God is the infinitely perfect and beautiful object. And think about the multiplication of love that you have, if you have multiple children, and just multiply that by literally infinity. It's an unfathomable thing to think about what that love would mean and what that bliss would be in that state. It is beyond comprehension. And so I'm tying all these up into one reality, right? To say this is what communion with God is. We have the beatific vision, which is the end of the intellect. And then we have this enjoyment of God, which is the end of the will. And then we have this broader theme of love, which draws the affections in this powerful, incredible way, the affections and the will toward God. And this is our eternal bliss and hope. Now, I know I've ended my time, but I do want to say something about application today. So I'll be as quick as I can here. We're talking about a future hope, of course. We're not going to have this direct knowledge of God, this intuitive knowledge of God now. Some kind of mystics and stuff want that in this life, but that is held out for us in the future. But that doesn't mean that we can't now partake of this in some way. St. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians, and he is writing to the Corinthians about the story of Moses on Mount Sinai. And Moses, when he's on Mount Sinai, enters into the presence of God. He is in the presence of God's glory. He sits with him, communes with him. He speaks to God as a man speaks to his friend, the text tells us. And when Moses comes down the mountain, he looks like a god. Something about God has transformed him profoundly, to such an extent that it can be seen. The glory of God is shining his face. He's lighting up. St. Paul, when he's writing to the Corinthians, talks about this. And one of the ways that he applies this is he says, the glory of God has shone in our hearts. Like Moses. There is something that is true about the Moses story that is true about us. That as we look to the face of Christ, we are transformed. You see, this is like preparation for what we have in the beatific vision. We do now, and we can now come before God and sit with him and contemplate him. I'm a big proponent of Christian contemplation meditation, which is more than just kind of reading your Bible quickly to get information, but to actually sit with God's word. Contemplate it. Think about it. Rest in it. And as St. Paul tells us, that will have a transformative effect on you. You will enjoy God more. You will love God as he transforms us. This is what people are talking about when they use the term theosis. It is a preparation for what we receive in eternity. And we can, in a sense, even partake of this now. Okay, well, with that, I've given you a lot of material. I know this was really dense, and I know it was very theological, but I hope what I have done is given you some things to contemplate. And I hope that you will take some of these truths and actually spend some time to think about them and all the truths that are presented in this conference, to meditate on them, to think about them, to pray about them, that God may transform you to conform to the image of his Son. Thank you.